Thank you everyone for joining. We're going to be recording today, so just an FYI. Um, yeah, so thank you for joining our um, today's conversation, which is one called Your Kufiyya Scares Me, Weaponizing Safety as Zionist Smear Tactic. And this is one event in a series of events that takes really seriously the question of Zionist smear campaigns as a critical subject of study. And so this is one event as part of a series that's really taking a look at different things like hate mail and different ways in which um, anti-Semitism can be weaponized against organizers, scholars, activists around who are anti-Zionist, who are struggling for Palestinian freedom and justice and liberation. And so this is today's conversation is going to be specifically talking about the weaponization of safety and different things that come up today. So I am really happy to uh, welcome our guests. Um, so my name is Jennifer Mogannam. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at UC Santa Cruz, and I am also a collective member of the ICSZ and a longtime Palestinian organizer and wear many different hats. And I'm excited also to welcome Cynthia Franklin, who's a professor of English at the University of Hawaii and a co-editor of the journal Biography and a founding member of Students and Faculty for Justice in Palestine at UH. And I also want to welcome Maura Finkelstein, who is a writer and anthropologist, author of a book called The Archive of Loss, Living Ruination in Mill Land, Mumbai, published by Duke in 2019, and whose writing appears in many other online and academic publications. And you'll learn more about them through the process of this and us through the process of this conversation. But so those are just short openings for very powerful people in the room today. Um, so I wanted to begin by opening up the space to think about the different ways in which the question of safety kind of becomes this issue within the terrain in academia and beyond, but especially in US school and university spaces. We see that a lot of times our classrooms, our presence on campuses, posters on our office doors and things like that get sort of charged with making students feel unsafe. And we know that there is really no grounds for this other than that we are scholars, students, workers in university and school spaces that talk about Palestine, that maybe teach about Palestine, that support student movements for Palestine, that organizes faculty for Palestine, and that just that raising of the question of Palestine becomes a threat that is being mobilized through this sort of language of safety. So whereas there's this kind of ungrounded charge of lack of safety, um, those of us who are struggling for the liberation of Palestine have had more literal threats, right, to our quote unquote safety. So that can take the form of many things. And we examine that here in the ICSC through things like hate mail. But we know that uh, Palestinian scholars and students and our co-strugglers, our allies, face many different issues on campus, threats to our jobs, threats to our families, and our personal well-being, Zionist sort of uh, anti-Palestinian propaganda showing up via uh, showing up at our houses, publishing and posting around flyers, people's faces on trucks with slanderous claims about them. Doxing, of course, is a big question. With sites like Canary Mission, but then also on Twitter and or X and different venues that smear individuals. Hate mail that we receive. We'll be talking a little bit about some of the hate mail pieces that we've received, and fear mongering, really trying to make people afraid to talk about Palestine, to teach about Palestine, to speak about it, which can turn into a form of self-censorship. We've seen deportations, visa revocations on the rise. And all of this is really under the guise of unsubstantiated accusations of anti-Semitism. Um, and we see this because the linking of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism has been really profound. And so we see any critique of a foreign nation state as being put under the guise of anti-Semitism. I'm sure many of you here are familiar with that. And so one thing that I think I also just want to highlight before I pass to my co sort of panelists is that especially in the classroom, but not exclusively, we can start to understand and parse out the difference between a lack of safety and discomfort. There is supposed to be discomfort in our classrooms when we're learning about things that we don't often get to learn about until perhaps we enter university space or community space. Discomfort is a pedagogy. It is a part of the learning process, and feeling uncomfortable is not the same as feeling unsafe. But those two things have kind of been collapsed into each other as we see this sort of escalation in what's long been present around this conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And so I'll just end by sharing just a small anecdote of some hate mail that I received in the past year, which is that this is probably the worst piece of hate mail I received, which basically I was sent a picture of Palestinians buried under rubble in Gaza and basically was told that I should be there alongside them. And I am a Palestinian scholar, and so that lands very particularly. And these are the kinds of things that we receive sort of collectively on a daily basis, right? So I'm going to pass off to Maura.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to the Institute and Yulia for putting this together. And it's really, it's an honor to be here with you, JMO and Cynthia, and everyone in the audience. Thank you so much for being here. I want to start by thinking about the weaponization of safety really generally, because I think it's important to start by sort of like carrying off that, with that horrible image. Jim, I'm so sorry about that. That is actually violence. And just acknowledging that for decades, if not longer, Palestinian scholars and students have been experiencing incredibly violent, incredibly destructive attacks, smear campaigns, in addition to Muslim, Arab, Iranian scholars, students. And we're really seeing that violence sort of culminate not just in students being shot, students in Vermont, but also now with students being disappeared by ICE, detained, deported, held indefinitely. We're seeing very real material violence, and the people who are experiencing that real material violence, in addition to Palestinians in Gaza, are Palestinian, Muslim, Arab, Iranian scholars and students in the United States. And so it becomes even more infuriating to see how over the past 20 months, the attacks against Palestinian liberation movements and the attacks on behalf of Zionism have all been through the weaponization of this idea of Jewish, and by Jewish we mean Zionist, student safety. Like, how is it that these particular students, whoever they are, who, as far as I can tell, are not actually experiencing any real tangible violence. They're not being brutalized by the police. They're not, being disappeared. They're not being shot. These are not things that are actually happening, but they are, weaponizing this language of safety in order to protect State of Israel, Zionism, the genocide, and we'll talk more about the difference between safety and comfort. But I think it's really important to just sort of highlight how, despite the fact that probably everybody in this room has been drawn into these discussions about whether or not students who want to support genocide are being made to feel unsafe, and this is again about feelings, this is happening amidst the most horrific material violence that probably anyone has actually ever seen in our lifetimes. I mean, the images that we see out of Gaza every day become worse and worse and worse beyond one's imagination. There's really like nothing, no cruel and violent act that hasn't been shown to us as happening to Palestinians in Gaza because of Israel and their genocidal siege. And so when we talk about safety and unsafety in the United States, it's almost as though words do not matter. This is about power. This is about silencing. And so in addition to, again, this like very, very real material violence that Palestinians, Muslims, Arabs, Iranians, and also anti-Zionist allies are experiencing, there's also this incredible use of unsafety as this sort of non-existent anti-Semitism that's creating an environment on our campuses, in our classrooms, in which faculty, staff, and students who dare to even talk about genocide, who dare to even criticize Zionism, are threatened with, if not direct material violence, the sort of structural violence of loss of employment, loss of healthcare, loss of housing. When students protest and they are barred from campus, that often means that they are losing their housing, they're losing their access to food, they're losing access to safety. Perhaps, their homes are not safe. Perhaps campus has been the only place that has been safe. And so there's this way in which these different levels of actual unsafety are being like sort of disappeared as we continue to buy into, even if we don't believe it, we're buying into it because we're participating in these conversations about whether or not Zionists actually feel unsafe, and whether or not that is discursively powerful enough to compete with the images we're seeing, the reality that we're seeing. And so, as so many of us are being drawn into, engagements with our administration, when we're defending our teaching, we're defending our speech, we're defending our publication, the actual reality of violence and unsafety disappears. And this sort of, potential possibility of unsafety in terms of feelings emerges as central. And so, I think, and, we'll continue to talk about this, especially in terms of comfort and discomfort, but I think a lot of us have seen how terms like anti-Semitism, terms like safety, terms like feelings, they actually do not mean what we think they mean. And so we're entering into conversations, discussions, processes with institutions who are acting not only in bad faith, but in a sort of, especially an environment of higher ed, we're seeing meaning being evacuated. We're seeing actual stakes being evacuated. And so for those of us who actually exist in reality and are seeing reality, it becomes this very, very unstable landscape in which not only is the terms in which we can have these discussions constantly shifting, but the language that we are using to reflect the reality that we are experiencing doesn't even mean what it means anymore. And I think that, bringing that into, again, not the same as material violence, but seeing it as a tactic of justifying material violence by, perpetuating this sort of like emotional, affective, and linguistic violence, I think has really destabilized people's ability to continue to show up and push against this narrative. So I'll pass it over to Cindy for now.
Thanks. And thank you both, and thanks for being here. As Maura was saying, it's really an honor, and I really appreciate the important work that the Institute is doing. These spaces are so important. So I'm speaking from Hawaii, which is a place that, like Palestine, although in, of course, very different ways, is under occupation and a site of settler colonialism. And in large part owing to the kinship between Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiians, and Palestinians, safety has been weaponized at my university in ways that are far less newsworthy or dramatic than, the kinds of things that that you were describing are happening, JMO, and Maura. And Maura, you of course, were fired for your Palestine advocacy. So we, because there is this kind of kinship between Kanaka Maoli and Palestinians, the university admin has been much more tentative about enacting forms of repression. And in fact, up until, I would say, January, we had a kind of best case scenario in terms of being left alone. Nonetheless, we have seen weaponizations of safety that I want to discuss, because I think they are pervasive as well as harmful, in large part because they can go so easily undetected in ways that can quell Palestine solidarity, this Palestine solidarity movement. And I think they also have things to teach us about how liberals are hastening us, as they hide our slide into authoritarianism. So I just want to tell a few kind of stories that put this, that I hope provide some illustration of this. So in October 2023, our SFJP, or Students and Faculty for Justice in Palestine, welcomed Malak Matar, the internationally renowned young artist from Gaza, to Honolulu. Her visit took place less than 2 weeks into Israel's genocide. During her October 19th lecture, she told us about how her family had already been displaced 6 times. She also was having to check her phone as she spoke, because her family was currently under direct bombardment. After she concluded her lecture, men unfurled Israeli flags and began advancing on her, shouting, "Stop the Jewish genocide," and shouting about killing babies. So we recognized these men right away. The previous week, they had been part of a group who had moved in on those of us participating in a campus sign waving for Palestine, shouting, "We will kill you." 2 weeks after Malak's visit, one of them, draped in his customary Israeli flag, came right up into my face at Campus Center. Students had gone there with a Free Palestine banner when they heard that Hillel students were tabling for Israel. And so along with a few other faculty members, we went over just to make sure the students stayed safe. And one of the men who had threatened Malak came right up into my face and said, "We know who you are. We've been watching you. Your days are over." So for each of these events, as at every event our SFJP has held over the past 18 months, campus administrators have shown up along with campus security and often the police. In each case, as we've been threatened or had our events disrupted by Zionists, officers have either stood by and done nothing or have actually just joked around with the Zionists. Sometimes they hug them or shake their hands. When Malak was being physically advanced upon, they stood outside while a group of women circled the men, and we joined hands and kept the men from advancing on Malak. At Campus Center, when my colleague reported hearing one of the men tell me my days were over, the officer just shrugged. So these are not instances of police brutality or repression, but they do leave us unsafe as they make clear that equations of free Palestine are seen as the same as those as "we will kill you." And I also, this kind of surveillance that is in place in the name of our safety is, of course, especially threatening to the undocumented members of our community who are actually afraid at this point to show up for events, as well as, to our Palestinian Muslim Arab members. The administration's response has been similarly unspectacular and also contributory to our lack of safety. The administrative response to the attack on Malak was to send an email suggesting we could get individual counseling if we had been distressed. The student who attacked Malak on October 19th went on to file a Title VI complaint about the insensitivity of hosting Malak so soon after taking Israeli hostages. I was named in that complaint for telling the men to get the fuck out of the room. When called in by administrators after the Title VI was filed, I was not disciplined, but I was made like I was the one who had behaved badly and needed to account for and defend my actions. And when I sent videos that exposed the lies in the Title VI complaint and also asked to know if the man who had threatened me had a record of physical violence, I did not receive any follow-up. When the DOE did not dismiss the Title VI, the admin held a number of Zionist-run webinars on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in the name of ensuring the campus remained safe for Jews and Muslims. When we wrote to the university president stating the webinars did not simply erase Palestine, but left us with less safety than ever, especially our Palestinian students and Arab and Muslim students, we were told we had the freedom to continue expressing our opinions as you have done in the past. In each of these meetings, even as the administration has very sanctimoniously voiced support for our right to free speech, they have been quietly putting into place more and more administrative roadblocks and restrictions, prohibiting chalking, shrinking free speech zones. And when we have challenged these administrative clampdowns, they have said, no, we haven't done that, when in fact they clearly have. And then also saying, oh, well, actually, we're doing those for your safety. So each of these responses creates a kind of chill that leaves students and faculty afraid to turn up for lectures, let alone protests. What these responses have made clear is that when there's talk about security and safety, it's Zionists creating conditions of unsafety who are protected in the name of guarding against anti-Semitism, and those standing for Palestine who are being left even more unsafe in the name of a safety that takes the form of policing, surveillance, and disrespect. So later on, I'm happy to talk more about the material impacts in such unspectacular weaponizations of safety, but I'll stop there for now.
Yes, thank you both. I think Maura and Cindy really offered us some concrete anecdotes on how we can think about both the framing of this question and some of these stories that really elucidate some of the things we want to unpack in today's conversation and that we want to foreground in today's conversation. So I'm going to ask each of them some questions so that we can elaborate on the discussion. And I'm going to start with Maura. So what are some of the problems that come with equating safety with comfort and with the understanding of safety as militarized forms of security and surveillance?
Yeah, thanks for that. So I want to start by just sort of thinking what, and I think you both have drawn attention to this, but just thinking about the critical centrality of discomfort in learning and the way that us, in my particular case, and I'll talk a little bit more about the details later, but I taught at two small liberal arts colleges, one of which I was assistant professor and then associate professor. And I'm also trained as an anthropologist. And a big part of a liberal arts education, a big part of an anthropological education is really rethinking or challenging or expanding how we understand the world in all of these different ways. We all are teaching in the liberal arts. And the ways that we as teachers and scholars invested in thinking about spaces of learning, in and beyond institutions of education is very much through all of the conversations I've had with folks who have experienced these smear campaigns, really a practice of care, of community care, of awareness of power and the dynamics of a classroom. And for years I would enter my classroom and tell my students that the classroom was not a safe space, that borrowing from Black feminist thinkers, that it was, we could imagine it as a brave space, that I was inviting everyone to sort of be accountable and think and learn together, but that the baseline of engagement, and I realized that there are problems with the category of the human, but I would tell my students, my undergrads, that the only rule that the classroom held as gospel was that nobody was allowed to dehumanize anyone else. Nobody was allowed to deny the humanity of anyone else. And that as long as we kept that rule in mind, we were allowed to challenge each other. We were allowed to push at each other. And for me, I think, and for other people who have had accusations of unsafety in their classrooms, thrown at them over the past 20 months, it's quite disconcerting, to say the least, to see the way that community care gets weaponized, so that instead of really thinking, what is discomfort? What does it mean to sit with discomfort? What does it mean to challenge one's worldview? It can be very painful. It can be very liberatory. It can be everything in between. Instead, we are living through a moment in which certain students, and only certain students, Zionist students, students who uphold empire, students who support genocide, are being given permission to opt out of this model of education, and not just opt out of it, but sort of transform it into something that can be violent, that can be about surveillance, that can be about sort of leveraging the power of institutions, of the state, of the police, et cetera, in order to really dismantle that possibility in the classroom, that possibility of really thinking elliptically, thinking beyond the limits of our own imagination. And so there's the violence of shutting down that possibility in the classroom. And then there's also the violence of, privileging certain constructions of safety, again, over real safety. And the thing that I think needs to be said over and over and over again, and so it sounds repetitious, is that students who are leveraging feelings of unsafety because they identify as Zionist, because they support Israel, they're not actually talking about safety. What they're talking about is a refusal to sit with the discomfort of occupying a position that supports genocide. And when we enter into these bad faith conversations that are really about supporting and upholding empire and settler colonial violence, it actually undermines what it is that learning on campus is really about. And I think it's really also important because I think we'll talk more. It's, you know, we have the smear campaigns that are happening in the classroom, and then we have the smear campaigns that are happening beyond the classroom. And I also want to think about in a bit the relationship between these online smear campaigns and their partnership with our institutions, which I think is something that's really new in my experience. But I also think that for a lot of people that I am in conversation with, including myself, I received a complaint from one student about my classes on October 12th. And the complaint was that he felt unsafe in my class. He didn't pursue that complaint. It was dropped. And he now, as far as I know, has moved to Israel and joined the Israeli military, in case you're wondering where he sits ideologically. But every other sort of attack on who we are as teachers, who we are as educators, they're usually coming from outside actors who have no idea who we are, who have no idea what's happening in our classrooms. If they're coming from students, they're not, I mean, I think Cynthia's example is really great. They're not coming from students inside of our classes who are taking our classes, who are engaging with us, who are thinking with us, and are finding, you know, violence in those spaces, because I don't think that violence usually exists in those spaces. It's really part of a coordinated campaign. I mean, on my campus, I saw it in terms of students who are trained by Hillel International and Hasbara fellowships to really just recycle over and over and over again the same kind of smear campaigns that, you know, weaponize a feeling of vulnerability and unsafety as a Jewish person, but are actually just reproducing over and over and over again talking points of the Israeli military and the Israeli state. And so this notion of, you know, how do we, or this idea of how do we disentangle accusations of safety that are really accusations of discomfort, that are actually revealing the way in which challenges to, you know, the sort of ideologies of empire, the ideologies of settler colonial violence, the ideologies of genocide is actually a profoundly uncomfortable position to inhabit. And so what we're finding is that students, their parents, donors, people on the internet do not want to see their buy-in to these violent ideologies and violent structures and violent acts. And so the destruction of any challenge becomes central, and safety becomes the weapon through which you not only are reproducing the language of the state, but you're using the violence of the state to quash any kind of challenge. And so then I think the question remains, what on earth are our classrooms for? What on earth are our campuses for? Is it actually possible to see those as spaces of learning if we're seeing institutions partnering or utilizing these attacks, these smear campaigns, to actually evacuate from these institutions all the things that are actually able to happen as processes of learning despite the structures and investments of the institution. And so it's actually quite, I think there's something really dangerously strategic about the language of safety. And I think it's really important to refuse to engage it, to refuse to enter into these discussions of student safety, because they are actually not about safety at all.
Thanks, Maura. That was really powerful. And you gestured to some of the, you know, largely this has been happening from external organizations and individuals. And I just wanted to share that we're not going to unpack all of those in this session, but some of the other sort of discussions in this series did touch on those institutions, as well as the Institute's podcast, Unpacking Zionism. There's a new like mini series that goes through many of the institutions that are specifically sort of you know, targeting institutional power, and they kind of reflect the interconnectedness of how these institutions that mobilize power in different ways get sort of their the ear of the high administrative levels of the institutions in which we work and teach, and the government, things like that, but especially academic institutions. I wanted to just, one thing that you said that I think we should keep in our minds for this conversation that I just thought was really beautifully put in one sentence is that what we're talking about when we're talking about the weaponization of safety from Zionist students is that the question's not about safety, it's about the refusal of Zionist students to sit with the discomfort of supporting genocide. And I think, you know, this is one theme that we're talking about today, but really piecing out this idea of safety versus comfort and thinking about discomfort also as a pedagogy in our classrooms. And so I think that was really beautifully put. I wanted to pivot to Cindy now, to see if you could speak a bit about some of the trends and how Zionist Jews relate to anti-Zionist Jews and sort of this denial of Jewishness in place of a conflation of the two. Um, and sort of the timeline and how this has shifted.
Yeah, thank you for that. This is going to be really tentative, and I'm really interested in what you both have to think about this, as well as people in the audience. And I'm just going to speak kind of anecdotally in ways that have made me think about this. So, you know, in 2014, that was a period where I got quite a bit of hate mail, I think because of the American Studies Association academic boycott campaign, as well as having put together a special issue of biography on life in occupied Palestine. And, you know, JMO, you were talking about the what hate mail sticks in your mind. And the piece of hate mail I received then that really haunted me was a piece of hate mail saying, um, you know, saying that, you know, calling me Jewish and saying, so shame on you. And I hope you will be the first one to go to the shower and turn into worm dust. And there was just something so horrific about the anti-Semitism of that, but also the kind of way that it was being done in the name of defending Jews, but also calling me a bad Jew. And a lot of the kind of hate mail that I received then was about being a self-hating Jew and a bad Jew. And I just want to kind of fast forward to a few weeks ago. And thank you to Canary Mission for putting me on their homepage, which has meant that I'm getting some more hate mail, which I hadn't been getting for a while. And I got some hate mail saying, you know, oh, you know, again, just saying, I hope you'll be dropped onto the Madeleine and, you know, disappear into the sea. And there was, you know, something about that was just making me kind of think about the open owning. And here it's not like Palestinians are like the Nazis. Here it's like the Israelis are the people that are enacting the violence. They're going to disappear people into the sea. And hey, I hope you go. And there was just something that made me kind of think about that open owning of and defending of Israeli violence in ways that also I feel like I've become increasingly discounted as a Jew, as are other anti-Zionist Jews. It's like we're not even in the category of Jewish. And I've kind of seen this called unjewing. But I was thinking about how there is this kind of formation that feels somewhat new to me, that even as there's this professing to care about anti-Semitism, this happens through kind of substituting Zionism for Jewishness rather than conflating the two and having it both ways. So Zionism is Jewishness because anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, but also that Zionism is kind of cut free of Jewishness and is only about defending Israel. You know, so we have the neo-Nazis who are defending Israel and, are proud Zionists. And so I feel like there's something new about this moment that I haven't quite got my hands, or my head around. But, what has, I feel like, remained really constant is meeting structural analyses and calls for freedom and justice with violent misogyny, racism, ageism, homophobia, Islamophobia, gaslighting of all kinds. And, ways that, I guess the thing that's different is that I feel like this used to be the underbelly of what passed for, more civil forms, seemingly civil forms of Zionism. And I think like Stephen Salaita has discussed this really powerfully on civil rights. But I feel like in this moment that we're in, the Trump and Netanyahu regimes are owning these things. There's no longer we're the most moral army in the world. There's no longer we're the only democracy in the Middle East. Um, there's just like naked militarized colonial aggression with no interest in anyone's safety or defense of humans. So securitization is about securing land and money, as opposed to, I just feel like it's almost like the gloves are off and there's no longer even a pretense that this is for people's safety. So it just feels like there have been some unmaskings of what's always been at the foundation, but it's now just more barren and ugly. And there's almost this way that the hate mail is more in line with what is happening through the governments, or I don't even like to, through these regimes that are in power. They're just speaking the same language as opposed to, you know, um, governments that that put a pretty package around that kind of violence. So I'll stop there, but I'd be really interested in hearing, your guys' thoughts about that, or if that, like, I'm just kind of been speculating about all this. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, indeed. That was super helpful. I think at the beginning of hopefully we'll be able to unpack more in this conversation. I wanted to speak just briefly to this question of hate mail smear campaigns and how these campaigns tend to target us as individuals, and if we sort of zoom out and instead of thinking about them as like personal or individualized attacks, and move toward thinking about what are these campaigns trying to do on a structural level, and hopefully that will move us to a conversation on how we can think about these isolated instances on a more collective and broad-based level, so as to kind of resist and respond to them, and what could be some strategies that we think about. And so I wanted to just say that when these campaigns are definitely happening on a structural level, there's an entire ecosystem and so much money also that goes into ensuring that there's like a sustained attack of these kinds across the world. I think the university and education in the United States and beyond, but especially in the United States, has become this central terrain of um, sort of Zionist warfare, propaganda, if you will. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that the university is really the space where the Zionists are seeing major shifts in how teaching and learning is being done, but also major shifts that indicate a generational shift. We're seeing now in the terrain of education that young people are more and more not content with the status quo of Zionism, just continuing to operate in this way, and are really interested. I mean, I, as someone who teaches in ethnic studies, where our entire curriculum, right, is about unpacking power and locating it, and how we kind of situate different questions of injustice within larger structures of power, um, students are really interested in um, unpacking these questions on a deeper level, and the university is now offering that to them. And so there is a new and different platform than what has traditionally, I mean, like when, and this has changed a lot over time, and there are different reasons why this has changed over time. But like, for example, when I was doing undergrad, it was like a very Palestine was a very scary thing. We didn't have a ton of allies. People didn't want to touch it. They didn't know what it would entail. And so that fear and the uncertainty of, well, I just don't have enough information and this is controversial, even among some of the, student orgs, for example, who are now our SJP's closest allies, they weren't sure they wanted to enter that terrain. And so we've seen a rise in solidarity and a rise not just in solidarity, but in linking our struggles together. And that is really threatening to the Zionist project. Seeing and for decades, the Zionist project has been trying to um, push Zionism within some of these communities. So they have, for example, like very targeted programs for historically Black colleges and universities, for example, right? Um, to try to push Zionism sort of as a framework that aligns with Black struggle. For example, we see that this is unraveling now, that this is collapsing, and so I do think that the university is a central terrain for them in that sort of um uh, debate, right? It's where we see sort of um the decline of Zionism among popular opinion. I think they're locating as the university space being a central place for that. I also want to just raise that, I think it was Cindy, you were talking about this question of anti-Semitism, but then also allying with neo-Nazis and things like that. And so when we're thinking about Zionism in relation to anti-Semitism, I also think we need to be thinking about how these like Zionist tactics are really collapsing and reducing the weight of what the meaning of anti-Semitism is, because the Zionist propaganda would rather ally itself with actual Nazis who support the sustenance of the state of Israel than to give weight to actual acts of anti-Semitism, right? And so by labeling people who support Palestine as anti-Semitic, it actually is, in some cases, threatening to the Jewish experience when actual acts of anti-Semitism happen, because it's not the centerpiece of the kind of anti-Semitism that's being taken up by the Zionists. And I think that's something that we can keep in mind and continue to think about. And I think ICSD also thinks about that in different ways. But I think, what are their goals? So the education is a main target, but so are movements, right? And things like infiltration, things like I think maybe both of you raised like Title VI charges, trying to use the law, Freedom of Information Act, Public Requests Acts to try to target. And I think the goals here are to instill fear, to silence us, to censor any discussion or debate around the question of Palestine. And I think it's not working. I mean, there is some fear and some self-censorship that does happen. And I think the last webinar in this series talked a little bit about how self-censorship does creep in these different ways, and sometimes we don't even locate it right away in our own selves, you know. But resisting sort of that impulse is part of the equation here, and thinking about um, sort of resisting the individualization of these attacks and thinking about them on a more structural level. And so I think on that note, we want to pivot to sort of thinking about both material impacts, but how do we respond collectively and build a strategy about responding collectively, and what does that mean and what does that look like? And so I want to give the floor to Maura to talk a little bit about your case and thinking about it as one blueprint for repression to come, and also how we can counter that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for those thoughts and provocations. It's really helpful. And, you know, following both of you, I'll start by sharing one of the like little attacks, smear campaigns against me. But you know, there are so many horrific stories. Of course, I have different ones, but we get like really violent, devastating messaging all the time. And I want to share one that I actually thought was like kind of funny, but also speaks to something that Cindy brought up, but also just what are these smear campaigns doing on the level of the institution? So you know, about a year ago, there was this like really lively Twitter thread that had decided that I wasn't really Jewish and was sort of like answering that question by this like wild speculation by lots of people that I've never encountered in real life about how there's no possible way that my mother was Jewish. And they found pictures of me and they were like analyzing my face and my social, like my facial structure and my nose. And I have a very Jewish nose, by the way. I'm very proud of it. And you know, going on and on about all of the reasons that I couldn't possibly really be a Jew. And you know, my mother, Esther Finkelstein, is pretty Jewish, but you know, so if she's watching, you know, apparently you're not Jewish. But the sort of end punchline was, but also she's just clearly too ugly to actually be Jewish, which I thought was like a really nice synthesizing of the sort of science behind such speculation. But I bring that up because one of the things that I found really interesting when I was interfacing with my institution in the fall of 2023, before I was placed on leave, so this is beginning around October 12th and lasting through the 2023 fall semester, was that I was constantly being brought in to meetings with the provost that I referred to as being called to the principal's office, in which there were these emails, there were sort of you know, online social media harassment, et cetera, that were being directed at the college and telling the college that I made all Jewish people on campus feel unsafe. And it was really a very like all Jewish people, all Jewish students, all Jewish staff, all Jewish faculty. And I would, you know, I've really changed the way, and I don't think we have the time to go into this, but I've really changed the way I talk about myself as a Jewish person in this moment, and how I use my Jewish identity to talk about this. But you know, at the time in the fall, I kept saying, well, you know, I am also Jewish. So it's not all Jewish people. You know, I'm talking to anti-Zionist Jewish students. I'm talking to anti-Zionist Jewish faculty and staff. And the provost would constantly say, no, you make all Jewish people feel unsafe. Really just sort of mimicking the language of the smear campaign that not only was accusing me of something that was not real, but also letting me know that because of who I was and what I was doing and how I was doing it, that I had been cast outside this identity category. And that when my administration talked about Jewish faculty, staff, and students, they were talking about Zionist faculty, staff, and students. And they were being very explicit in that move of really sort of picking up this framing of, you know, victim not as this like larger notion of Jewish, but this particular notion of Zionist. And so I thought that that was quite interesting, but it also sort of set off a continuous series of months in which the investigations that my college administration was undertaking in ways that were very much bad faith. I mean, I've read through the investigative report. I've gone through many appeals. My case has been investigated by the AAUP, and there's really no there to my case. I mean, it really is, a smear by outside actors and then a smear by the administration making claims that were non-existent and sort of going again and again to the language of, I made Jewish students feel unsafe, which is a pretty difficult thing to prove, especially because I've never actually met any of the Jewish students who accuse me of making them feel unsafe. But what I think is really scary and really chilling about my particular case that I think I'm seeing play out in so many different arenas is how perhaps in previous times there would be a smear campaign and a faculty, staff, or student receiving, like at the receiving end of the smear campaign, may or may not go to their college administrator, etc., and look for support from that institution. And I mean, we know from like Steve Salaita's case that, this is not entirely new, but I think the level in which we're seeing it is quite new. But now what we're seeing is that the institutions, the administrations, are actually partnering with those who are conducting these smear campaigns, which are, so absurd that they just keep being reproduced over and over and over again without any real substantive or individual data or evidence, and sort of working hand in hand and in partnership with, outside actors and also students and alum and parents and donors and all of these stakeholders who have identified someone who is a threat to the, Zionist ideology of the United States, of our institutions, of the college or university. And the college or university then takes that as evidence, as truth, et cetera, and then uses it for a continued campaign of smear that is leading to termination, expulsion, suspension, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that that's something that while we've seen it in the past, I don't know if we've ever seen it at such a high rate of bizarre partnerships. In which like reality and facts are being completely evacuated, and the accusations of anonymous smears are then being parroted by college and university administrators as some kind of proof or data or whatever. And so that I think is perhaps a chilling and unique development that we've seen over the past 20 months. And I think also on top of that, because of the weaponization of Title VI, which is how I was fired. It was a violation of the equal opportunity non-discrimination policy is what I was accused of, which is sort of wrapped up in Title VI. What you see is that college and universities are taking these campaigns of smear, they're taking them seriously and, targeting their faculty, staff, and students. And then they're sort of avoiding the actual faculty governance or other sort of adjudicating processes that have been instituted by the institutions that have been laid out in the faculty handbook, which are sort of policy and procedure. And they're locking them in these like black boxes with, in my case, because it was a small liberal arts college, Title VI was handled by Title IX, and then it becomes confidential. You can't speak about it. I've heard about faculty, staff, and students having to sign NDAs in order to enter into this. So not only are you being victimized by and attacked by these smear campaigns, but then the institution is both taking that seriously and also creating conditions in which, solidarity, community is being removed from, and this is made into a real individual experience. And of course, we see challenges to this all the time. We see the way that people are refusing to enter into this. But as a larger trend, this way of isolating individuals and suggesting that this is actually bad behavior by one person instead of a sort of collective attack on a larger movement, I think has also created a really chilling effect, because depending, I was at a school in which a lot of people felt insecure, and a lot of people felt like their jobs were already vulnerable before this even happened. And so the idea that the faculty were going to stand with me in any kind of substantial way didn't exist and never happened. And so it became this very isolated incident that was about my bad behavior instead of a larger landscape of repression. And of course, there are people who are having different experiences with this, but I think we both have to sort of figure out ways to challenge the willingness of administrators to take seriously these smear campaigns that we know are fabricated and, a sort of one size fits all attack that people are trained to engage. And also to, and I saw some, I was at a small liberal arts college. We didn't have a union. I wonder what would have happened if we had, we didn't have an AAUP chapter, we didn't have a union. And people were very overworked and underpaid and scared about their jobs, and also maybe thought that I should have kept my mouth shut and my head down, as is campus culture. But I also think that the way that institutions weaponize procedure in order to isolate us also makes this into an individual burden instead of a sort of collective experience. And I'll just sort of lastly say that when we talk about, what do we do? How do we counter this? I mean, I sort of go to the same line all the time, which is we're all going to have to give up things. We're all going to have to lose things. This movement is not possible. This resistance is not possible without loss. And so I also think that, we're way past a moment in which we need some kind of collective action. We need some kind of like larger imagining of community care in which people are willing to give up a lot of the reality and some of the fantasy of what it means to be part of these institutions. Because as long as we continue to sort of plow ahead with our heads down and triage as we can, we're just going to see this get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and more violent and more dangerous, and nobody is going to be safe. So I really think, it is that moment of thinking about, what do you have and what can you afford to lose, and how are you going to be willing to bring that into some kind of collective movement that realizes that there is no way to save our institutions without real action, and we cannot be quiet because, between 800,000 and 1 million Palestinians in Gaza have already been murdered, and 2 million are on the verge of starvation. And those are actually the stakes here. So I talked for a long time. I'll stop talking.
No, that was great, Maura. Thank you for that. And I think you've left us a lot to think about. I also just wanted to share that, in case you're not familiar with Maura's case, she was I believe, first actually tenured faculty, not pre-tenure, but tenured faculty who was actively teaching to be fired for over the question of Palestine. So there's other places that she's spoken about this, that you can get more information on if you weren't familiar with it, including a podcast that the Institute did with Maura. So we're like moving, I think Maura's case shows that we're moving into some new and different territories as well, potentially coming down more severely and more widespread. But I wanted to move to you, Cindy, to just think about the importance of like the unspectacular, the silencing, the censorship, the different things that aren't visible and that can be isolating, and what we can do to counter that.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to preface this by saying that, kind of attending to these less visible things, we owe this to Maura and to people who are losing their jobs. we owe this to the people that are willing to take these losses, to be brave, and, in ways that are actually quite small, especially those of us with privilege. Um, and, I just have been thinking so much about Laura Shihai's comment from one of the previous webinars about how people start policing their own thoughts. Not only what they'll say, but even what people allow themselves to think. And I feel like this has such ramifications in terms of the things that don't happen that can't be tracked because you just haven't allowed yourself to think them, or you're like, I won't put this book on my syllabus, or I won't teach this class because I know these things will happen. And I think it's really, really super pervasive, these kinds of self-policings that are happening. And in some cases, I feel really, um, there are really material harms that people can experience by saying things that are, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, or these things that you should just be able to say, because we're seeing people being kidnapped on the streets and, deported or, kind of put in these prisons, etc. So I don't want to diminish those kinds of real material harms. And at the same time, I think that, just watching what has been happening, at my own university in terms of undocumented students being rightly terrified um, to show up for protests, especially because now, we always have campus security monitoring and taking pictures often as well. And so there are these real forms of surveillance and policing that leave people unsafe. But I feel like some of the things I'm seeing happen are people that used to turn up for things are not turning up for things because they are afraid. And I also see Zionists really taking advantage of this and doing things that used to be merely annoying that are now downright dangerous. So, we've had a small group of Zionists on our campus who regularly go tattletaling like little children to administrators every time anyone speaks or moves in any way that is supportive of Palestine. And in the past, this has been merely irritating. I have a huge file of things I just refuse to answer. But what they are doing now is they are going after students with vulnerable citizenship status, and they are sending these tattletale emails, and they are CCing not only, they're not only writing to the president, but they're CCing lawyers who deal with deportations and immigration. So these are like direct threats. And I realize I'm getting a little bit off track in terms of the unspectacular, but I get so angry when I think about this, but the kind of pervasive chill that this creates is so substantial. And, I had student last semester, an Iranian student contact me and ask if I could take my syllabus down it was on a Google Doc because he was frightened of being connected to my syllabus. And, these are the kind of fears that people are having. Students are having anxiety attacks because of reading about the kinds of things that are happening, not only to people who are really outspoken, but I think, the deliberateness of also targeting people who have written an op-ed. A very mild op-ed is, it is a strategy to just kind of create and spread fear. And so I do just kind of want to say that for me, this points to the need to be so loud and visible. If you're not in, like I feel like as someone who is Jewish, as someone who is tenured. I mean, Maura has shown us this is not absolute protection, but I just feel the need that, those of us who have privilege to be as loud and visible as possible, and also to interconnect our struggles. And I've really been inspired by people in Hawaii. The students I work with are on the front lines of pretty much every, demilitarization efforts, Hawaiian sovereignty efforts, kinds of queer and lesbian struggles. They're doing it all. And they're doing it all with so much courage. And, I want to kind of reflect back to the story that I told at the beginning about Malak Matar's visit. And what happened as these men were advancing on her is that a line of women seemingly spontaneously, arose and formed a circle around these men with linked arms. And this was something that just visually was almost a replica of the line of Mana Wahine, or powerful women who blocked police from elders on Mauna Kea. And actually, Malia Osorio, who was one of the Kia'i, or protectors, who was part of that line, said this was a lei aloha, protecting Moloch. And that the kind of genealogy going back to Mauna Kea was part of why that happened so naturally, so quickly, and also owing to the fact that Palestinians had gone to the Mauna to protect that Mauna. And so these struggles are really interconnected, and these are forms of safety I like to think about as counters to the militarized security that is about, protecting money and grabbing land, and ways that we keep each other safe, and also, kind of protect land in a way that is about, the connections, the deep connections between land and people, not land as real estate or land as property. So, I do just want to say that as much as these smear campaigns are really frightening and have material consequences, we are very powerful when we stand together. And we really do owe it to the people who are being the most harmed by this. And all respect to you, Maura, for, the kinds of integrity that you've shown in the face of, like, I know you're saying, well, yes, people in Gaza are being murdered, and that is why we're here and what we're fighting to make stop. But that doesn't mean that the material harms here are not significant. And I just want to acknowledge that too. And JMO, the kind of violence that you're facing, which is just added violence as you're watching your people be exterminated on this mass scale, and to be subjected to this kind of hate mail is just, it's really horrible. And that's why I feel like we need to really be together.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cynthia. I think that's a really great place to leave off. And I think both of you gestured to, there are people on the front lines, the people, in Gaza right now and in Palestine are that first sort of front line that are really confronting the really mass material violence of Zionist aggression, relentless 20 months now, escalated, I would say, 20 months of escalated, accelerated Zionist aggression and genocide. But I think, and what you're both offering about, we do need to make a decision. We are going to all need to be in a position to sacrifice some things, and we need to know what that looks like. And I think I want to just share what I think has been on the minds of many Palestinian scholars, and especially junior scholars, is, Palestinian, we've had to, show up and rise to the occasion. We've been solicited for so many different things and needing to be the first to respond and to have something to say for the past 20 months, all while we're like, watching our family, friends, Palestinian kin that maybe we'll never meet in our lifetimes, right, being genocided, and needing to be functional people in society, needing to continue to publish and like teach and do all these things without some of the accommodations that we've seen in other historical moments for peoples of the university, both faculty and students. And I do want to like give a nod to a lot of the Palestinian junior scholars who have really shown up without the kinds of, albeit not, um, you know, universally solid, but much more solid protection that tenure offers. And so I think we do need to move towards this idea of, let's analyze our own positions. Let's strategize what power we do have, what power we can use as individuals in relation to the collective. And maybe, now's a good time to place any questions you all might have in the chat. And something that I would be interested in hearing from Maura and Cindy, if we don't have questions or if we have time, is also thinking about, when we're thinking about collective care and ways to support each other, there are so many people, scholars, students who are, facing a lot of these repression tactics alone. And they're not sure when is the right time to, make them public. When is the right time to garner more broad-based support? And we're obviously not going to answer that in the next 10 minutes, but I think it was something for us all to think about moving forward is like, what could modes of collective care look like? Maybe based on your experiences too, like what felt supportive to you in certain moments, and how can we continue to strategize around decisions of like, when do we go public? When is it better to stay silent? Is it better to stay silent in this particular moment? What sort of constitutes, a more broad-based campaign, and these kinds of questions that we're really thinking about too. But I really just want to thank you both for sharing your brilliant thoughts and contributions to today's conversation. I think it was very generative and needed and important. Yeah, so we'll pivot to questions if anyone has any to drop in the chat, or maybe we can speak on that last sort of question I posed as well.
I could quickly, while people are like thinking of questions, I could quickly say something in response to your question, and then Cindy, and just sort of to reiterate what an honor it is for me to be in conversation with you both. It means a lot. I think that, picking up on what Cindy was saying and thinking about what loss and struggle and engagement looks right now. I had a mentor in high school who taught me this, so I can't take credit for it. But I do think that there is a moment to really be very honest about what we have in the movement and what we have to lose, and to really understand that those vulnerabilities and, for lack of a better word, privileges look very different for different people. So I think when folks who are being targeted are thinking about what they should be doing in terms of community care, being public, et cetera, I don't think that everyone can do the same thing. I think that there are a lot of folks with vulnerabilities that require work that is done anonymously, that is done secretly, that is done behind closed doors, not just for their own safety, but for the safety of a movement. Sometimes you're part of collectives that can't be public. Sometimes you're working with groups that need to remain secret. And I think just really being aware of how we can both protect ourselves and protect each other. Those things are often interconnected. So I think everybody has something to bring to the movement, but that looks different for different folks. And so when people are being targeted and are trying to decide, like, do I go public? Do I sue my employer? Do I, bring this to the media attention, et cetera, et cetera? I think the question is, if you decide to bring attention to the way in which you're being targeted, can you both mitigate harm, continue to do towards you that might be disastrous? Is it going to help for other people to have you as a resource? Are there ways in which you can do that work secretly and protect yourself? Are there ways that you have less risks and you can do it more publicly? I mean, I know I lost my job, but also I have citizenship. I have a partner who, will help me pay the bills. I have a family who's not gonna, let me lose my housing. I, managed to find health insurance, even though it's really shitty. These are things that we have to constantly be asking, because it's not just about longevity of ourselves, but it's also longevity of the movement. And I think that that looks different for different folks, but I think that they're the questions we need to be asking ourselves.
Thank you for that. Cindy, did you want to say anything to add? Yeah.
I think I'll say something that segues into Maya's question about administrative response and, in terms of when to, or when to share information and how to share information. And so, I was named in FOIA requests recently, and through the Faculty for Justice in Palestine network, which I think is a really important network, realized that a bunch of friends had received the identical FOIA requests at their universities. And it was really important to know that, so then we could go to the administration and say these, identical things have happened here, and to strategize together. And, one of the things that had happened at a previous FOIA request that named me was that my administration, and again, similar ones had gone to different academics at some East Coast universities. So the administration at our university actually was able to say, look, this identical thing from Stand With Us, or as Nada Alia has said, Stink With Us, went here. And that administration went full on after this faculty member, requested their syllabi, did these huge investigations. But because the guy that was initiating this had put on some Reddit, kind of chat that this was the best way to harass faculty, our administration did recognize that this was harassment. And what they did is they actually said we're going to charge by the hour for these requests. And they did a similar thing to the second round of FOIAs. And I think that, one of the lessons of that is that these organizations that have plenty of money to pay the hourly fee, they don't do it. And why don't they do it? Because what they're looking for is an admin that is going to go after the faculty member in ways that, happen with you, Maura. Otherwise, it's not worth their while because they're not going to find anything through these FOIAs. So the whole point of them is to get administrations on board and to get someone fired, and also then to create this further chill effect. So I think that, it's so important to share information. And then I also just want to say that there is, and I feel embarrassed to admit this, but I'm going to admit it. There's a kind of shame sometimes that I feel when I get some of this hate mail. And I think that when it's shared, it dispels that, and you realize that it is collective. And oh yeah, everyone's, I've been called a, ugly old bag, a wizened person who, no wonder I care about water. I don't get any water. A kind of funny one was read a fucking book. And I'm like, yeah, I read a lot of fucking books. But anyway, I think that sharing these things can be a way also of dispelling some of, those kinds of taking those things on individually in ways that can feel bad even, and then you feel bad that you feel bad because you know how stupid that is. So anyway, I haven't looked at the other questions in here, but I see there are a bunch. So I don't know, Maura, if you want to take on, or JMO, some of the other ones that have come up in the chat.
Yeah, well, that last comment you said, I think was really resonant because there's no substantial juice or information around the attacks. It's like they comment on our looks, Mara doesn't look Jewish and you don't drink water and I have weird eyes or something and should be deported and things like that. Really, fat phobic, transphobic, lots of these kind of comments that are really have nothing to do with what they're charging us with anyways. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's important that you raise that, Cindy. We do need to I mean, sharing is helpful instead of just keeping it inside and feeling like it's individualized. I think we have um a few questions. I'm gonna pick, so there's one that I think is interesting, maybe you all could speak to, which is how does the irrationality of safety versus discomfort prevent post-Zionists and progressive Zionists from fully supporting Palestine? And then they shared at Princeton, many of these progressive Israeli groups do not collaborate with SJP because our chants, classes, and discussions are anti-Semitic. I'll put that in quotes. But so what pedagogical approaches can we use to help those unsure of being anti-Zionists and perpetuate Zionism because of their progressive but not radical stance? So that's, I think, an interesting question. I'm going to read the others as well.
I mean, I would just plug the Institute and other collectives and organizations that are doing the work of drawing attention to Zionism as a supremacist ideology that, you cannot sort of, a liberal Zionist is a Zionist, a post-Zionist is a Zionist. And so how do we continue to do the work to, show Zionism as it is, to provide, and again, I think a lot of people who are doing that work are in this room and behind these webinars, of just continuously doing the work to show through scholarship, through these workshops, through all of these different kinds of collective action, what Zionism is. I think that kind of work of changing public opinion, changing the way that Zionism has been normalized, and really reject that, just like we reject other forms of violent supremacist ideologies. I think for me, as a writer and academic, that's where I think so much of the work needs to be done, in order to then, I borrowing the sort of shame of the smear campaigns, to the post that got me fired, shame Zionists about their commitment to a supremacist ideology that is inherently genocidal, inherently apartheid, and inherently racist and violent. I think that's where a lot of the work needs to be happening.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're at time. We're at time. But that was a really dynamic discussion. And as Maura kind of gestured to, I failed to introduce at the beginning the ICSE's work, but we're a pretty young institute, about a year and a half old, a little bit long, about 20 months old, actually. We launched right around the time of this inception of this current accelerated genocide, and we've built a lot of resources in the process that really get to the core of the different ways that Zionism operates, how we can think about it from a more critical and power-centered lens, the different sort of institutions and power structures, and financial structures, war, technologies, and all these kinds of things are really at the core of the research that the Institute does. And so, if you're the link to our website was just dropped in the chat, but also and that can direct you to like the podcast and the journal that we have. And I think we're definitely here for more conversations like these. I think just another big thank you to Maura and Cynthia for being here and for participating in this dynamic conversation. And oh, was he actually released? I saw the judge ruling. This is amazing. That Mahmoud Khalil was just released right now. So that is such a happy place to end. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Yeah.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you.